Thank you very much for the introduction. And this presentation is entitled CCS Article 6 and Beyond, where over the next 25 minutes, you'll gain a global perspective of where CCS stands at the moment in Article 6, as well as more generally in the context of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. So the topics I'll be taking you through today are one, the landscape and potential impact of Article 6 on CCS, where we'll be diving into the nuances of the negotiations and share a little bit more history of CCS in the previous International Carbon Market Mechanism, the CDM. And two, CCS in COP27. This is from the Institute's On the Ground Experience and Observation in Sharm el-Sheikh. And then three, issues and expected measures towards generating CCS credits through the UNFCCC, which we hope can serve to generate interesting discussions and questions afterwards. So first, just a little bit about us. The Global CCS Institute is an international think tank with offices around the world. We have over 175 members at the minute across governments, global corporations, research bodies, and NGOs. Our mission is to accelerate the deployment of CCS for a net zero emissions future. And we do this through our fact-based advocacy, our thought leadership, and our authoritative knowledge sharing. And one of our main products is our flagship annual report on the global status of CCS. And you can see last year's report with the theme From Ambition to Action on the right. So let's get into Article 6 and the Article 6 landscape and CCS. I think just first to make it clear that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement actually consists of 8 paragraphs, with the most interest being at the moment on paragraph 2 and paragraph 4, known as Article 6.2 and 6.4. So generally, what Article 6 is saying is that countries that can choose to pursue voluntary cooperation in the implementation of their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs. And just to be very clear, an NDC is at the heart of the Paris Agreement, where they embody a government's mitigation and adaptation efforts under the agreement. So first, we can look at Article 6.2 and what that means for countries, and that's on the left-hand column. So Article 6.2 allows countries to trade emission reductions and removals through unilateral, bilateral, or multilateral agreements. These traded credits are called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs for short. And the Article 6 negotiations at the moment are primarily concerning ITMO accounting and reporting, such as the process for country authorization and applying corresponding adjustments, which were mentioned in the previous talk as well, and just to kind of clarify that further, a corresponding adjustment is where a reduction transferred to a receiving country's NDC is deducted from a host country's NDC, so to ensure no double counting. So just to also mention that Article 6.2 is active at the moment, with bilateral agreements announced in COP27, these being a climate rice project between Ghana and Switzerland, and the other being a renewable energy microgrid project between Vanuatu and Switzerland. And these kind of give an example of what an Article 6.2 cooperation can look like and how it could look potentially for CCS. So now we'll turn to Article 6.2, which is on the right-hand column. Article 6.2 creates a global carbon market, which is overseen by the Article 6.4 supervisory body. The supervisory body is composed of 12 members from the parties of the Paris Agreement, and they are negotiators of the Article 6 discussions at the moment, and they're based on regional groupings. And the way it's designed to work is that for a project to generate tradable carbon credits, known as certified emission reduction, CERs, the project would need to be approved by both the host country and the supervisory body. So key in Article 6.4 is that it replaces the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM of the Kyoto Protocol. And what's key here is that the Article 6 mechanism encompasses all countries, whereas the CDM was just applicable for the developed countries. And my previous distinguished speaker also mentioned the CDM, and I'll just dive a little bit deeper on that. So CCS became eligible for inclusion in the CDM as long as specific rules for CCS projects, which are known as modalities and procedures, were met. These were adopted in COP17 in Durban back in 2011. And as my previous speaker mentioned, it was a breakthrough at the time and was one of the top issues actually in the negotiations, where, in the interim, to get there were, two technical workshops that were conducted, supported by colleagues such as Tim Dixon from the IEA DHT, as well as the IPCC special report on CCS that came out in 2006. And I think another anecdote to mention is the initial proposals for a CCS project to be part of the CDM actually came from Malaysia and Vietnam in 2005. So, yeah, that 6-year interval between the proposal and actually getting the decision in Durban was initiated by Malaysia and Vietnam. So, with that short history lesson, we'll come back to what's happening now. And the supervisory body is now developing a methodology for carbon removals, which at the onset was motivated by nature-based removals, but inevitably it needs to include engineered removals, so DAC and BECS, which also inevitably brings about the storage component of CCS to the forefront at the moment. And what happened in Sharm el-Sheikh was a day before the beginning of the negotiations. The supervisory body proposed a recommendations document, but that did not get adopted. So now they will continue the discussions this year, and so far the document is quite high level, but we'll see how that pans out. So with that, what's coming up in 2023? For Article 6.4, there's a workshop to be organized by the 30th of April with a technical paper on issues identified in the workshop to be prepared, which will look at the accounting and authorization issues of Article 6.2. So nothing specific to CCS, more general, but still it will be very applicable to the application of CCS as well as other projects. For Article 6.4, parties and observer organizations are invited to submit their views on activities involving removals by the 15th of March of this year, and this will continue the conversation on the recommendations document. So now, as we look towards COP28, we'll just have a bit of a bird's eye view of what's going on with CCS in the UNFCCC architecture more generally, and talk about the Article 6 synchronicities there. So first, we have the global stocktake, which can clarify the role of CCS in country energy and industry systems. So at COP27, what we saw were contributions on CCS in the discussions from countries like the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Norway. They gave examples of what they're doing that encourages CCS in their respective governments. And just to mention that we're on, at the moment in the global stocktake, we're at the information gathering part of the process. So we've had the first technical dialogue in June last year, and then the second one in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the third technical dialogue will happen in Bonn this year. And then finally, this will culminate with a outcomes document in Dubai. And why this is important is that the outcomes document serves as a political message, and it takes stock of the global progress of the achievement of the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the global stocktake process is a 5-year cyclic process, and also a key factor of the Paris Agreement. So back to Article 6, where participating countries can trade ITMOs generated from a CCS project is voluntary. So I'll just repeat that. To generate an ITMO from an Article 6.2 project is up to the country's discretion. So how that will happen, we're still unsure, but there is nothing to stop a country from trading credits in terms using a CCS project. But how that will happen is still not clear and still has not happened. Another thing to mention is that ITMOs generated from Article 6.2 can also be transferred to Article 6.4. How that transfer will happen and that interchangeability is also still being discussed. And just to scratch the surface a little bit more on the carbon removals methodology from the supervisory body, the permanence and liability of carbon reversals would be, I would say, the paragraphs that are the most relevant to look at the future of CCS in the carbon markets going forward. So this is sort of what Article 6 kind of looks like for CCS in a more general context as well. I'll also briefly mention response measures, which is a forum that looks at the positive and negative impacts of mitigation policies, such as socioeconomic effects. So response measures has been in the UNFCCC from the start and just makes sure that any mitigation impacts or policies will not impact country economies in a negative way. And the forum eventually looks at both positive and negative impacts of response measures. So at COP27, what's critical for CCS is that the adopted work plan includes a lot of language on CCS, which will be discussed further in the forum. So they're looking to explore CCS, specifically CCUS, and also look at developing regulatory frameworks for CCUS and transport and strengthening policy support. And that, is also directly from the IPCC Working Group 3 report, which saw that strengthening policy support was a key barrier towards CCS deployment. So we'll also look at the TEC and CTCN. So the TEC stands for the Technology Executive Committee, and the CTCN is the Climate Technology Center and Network. So they also launched a work plan at COP27 where they're looking into digging deeper in the hard to abate industrial sectors, particularly the steel and cement sectors, which of course have a relevant relationship with CCS. And the TEC and CTCN basically work on technological requests from developing countries to deliver assistance and capacity building on technologies. So for CCS to be included here will depend on requests from developing countries. And from what I understand from the TEC and CTCN is they have worked very briefly on CCS with a pilot project in Texas, but they haven't received enough requests or any requests for a CCS project from a developing country. So that really depends on the appetite of developing countries going forward. So I think generally just what we want to show here is that CCS is becoming increasingly talked about in the UNFCCC in various different pockets. And it looks like we will continue the discussion in this critical decade of implementation. So now we will look at the issues and expected measures towards generating CCS credits. So there are a number of issues we can foresee, some being discussed already and some historical concerns. And here we present them with expected measures, which can also be considered as proposed resolutions. So the first issue is monitoring requirements to address leakages for geological storage. This is carried over from concerns from the CDM, and this could be addressed using the IPCC Greenhouse Gas Inventory Guideline in 2006, which includes monitoring methods and leakage risk assessment. Just to give an example, the EU CCS directive includes monitoring requirements, storage closure, and post-closure obligations, with compensatory safeguards in new legislation in case of leakage by surrendering a corresponding amount of EU ETS allowances. So just to show that this has been looked at in terms of a carbon crediting scheme, and there are workable solutions here. Another issue are concerns over the environmental and social impacts of CCS. This was also mentioned back in the days of negotiating the CDM. And what worked in the technical workshops back then was showing scientific research in the area to address the concerns raised. And we have many examples of research since on environmental and social impacts of CCS and ways to address them. And they're listed below in this presentation as examples. Another issue and measure on generating CCS credits in the future could be external pressure from environmental NGOs as well as parties not comfortable with CCS. And we have seen a little bit of resistance on, for example, engineered CDR in the Article 6 supervisory body discussions from some countries. So this definitely could impede progress or at least delay progress. So increased advocacy efforts and collaboration on CCS with NGOs, governments, and civil society can really address this and move this forward. And I think also it's critical to mention that the issues raised can be resolved definitely through the collaborative work of governments, industry, the finance sector, think tanks, and NGOs. So, in other words, international cooperation will be very advantageous in developing monitoring methodologies and technologies and bringing overall understanding in the global community towards CCS. And finally, we'll look at the progress needed for CCS in Article 6. So one would be methodologies for carbon removals projects, so BECS and DACs. The European Commission has recently proposed a certification on carbon removals to help reach net zero emissions. So this is an up and coming topic. And the question here could be also, will a DAC and a BECS projects be valued differently? And are there different liabilities? And how will that be addressed going forward? I think another question for the progress of CCS in Article 6 will be the clarification on the transfer of CDM modalities and procedures for CCS. So how will these set of rules look like and how they will be considered going forward? Other questions that arise from this will be how will they be carried forward to 6.4 and 6.2 respectively? Will they be differently handled? Will they be handled in the same way? Another question is how will the transfer between ITMOs and CERs happen? And how will the trading between the two different paragraphs work? And 3, the clarification on the price of CCS generated credits. So can and should there be a premium for CCS credits because of their potential to store CO2 on longer timescales, and that's from the IPCC mitigation on climate change report that showed that CCS credits can be stored. I mean, CO2 can be stored for 10,000 years. So based on scientific research that has been agreed on a UN level. And with that, I will thank you for listening. And just to mention that we have 2 reports that go into this in more detail. One is CCS in the latest IPCC report, and it looks at what exactly the scientific community have agreed on in terms of CCS. And the other is the COP27 outcomes, which looks at more generally the global stocktake response measures in the CTCN and tech, and how they can assist in accelerating the deployment of CCS, and more detail on Article 6 and decisions that were taken in Sharm el-Sheikh. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Al Amer, for your valuable insight. We understand how the Article 6 discussions of the Paris Agreement could affect the ITMOS, including joint crediting mechanism and the credit markets of CCS. Now I would like to invite questions for Ms. Al Amer's presentation. Ms. Al Amer, could you answer this question? I have a question to Noora Al Amer, please. What is your opinion? Does a transfer of CO2 across country boundaries will always automatically require an Article 6 framework between the two countries? even if Article 6 between the countries is initially not intended?
So I'm not sure I understood the question completely, but basically between countries, when it comes to Article 6.2, it is up to the country's discretion whether they wish to trade on CCS on a CCS project, and they could use methodologies available in the future or current methodologies. For Article 6.4, how that will look like will be dependent on the modalities and procedures. And again, how those modalities and procedures will look like for Article 6.2 and 6.4 is still not clear. But again, I'm not entirely sure if I answered that question or I understood the question completely. So if maybe you could elaborate a bit more so I could be able to grasp it.
Thank you very much. Okay, the next question is regarding credits generated by CCS. What would be the power balance within the context of COP participants between supporting countries and those opposing? Could you describe types of countries?
Yeah, so this shows the importance of the global stocktake and other processes, because what the discussions are like in those rooms really can transmit to the Article 6 negotiation rooms, and you'll find the different groupings and the different constituencies have generally a similar outlook on CCS. But I've also what we found during the discussions in COP27 is a lot of countries are still not entirely clear on their position on CCS, and some countries are more curious. So, for example, in the global stocktake, we had India and Kenya asking questions on CCS, and recently we've also heard an announcement from India on CCS. So that was a interesting precursor coming from there. And then, in terms of the supervisory body, at least, we had African countries, especially, and the concern of Latin American countries that expressed concerns over engineered carbon removals. So that again shows the kind of position of these countries just more generally for CCS. We also have in the global stocktake at least some resistance from some of the other observer organizations, so environmental groups, youth organizations, and women and gender organizations that express concerns on CCS. So these sort of things does impede progress on CCS in the negotiation atmosphere. That being said, a lot of progress has been happening for CCS. So, for example, in terms of response measures, we have a very robust work plan for CCS that's in store for the forum, and that could be a really interesting way for not just countries but also companies to come in and share experiences on CCS. So that is something to look out for. Another aspect I would say is in terms of the tech and CTCN is they are inherently technologically neutral. So that's why I mentioned that it depends on the requests from developing countries. So if there's more awareness from developing countries, then definitely there will be more requests and more of an appetite. What we saw in terms of the side events was increased CCS, for example, in the Caribbean. So lots of interesting emerging markets that are introducing CCS into their energy mix, into their energy production matrices. So that is sort of an overview of what's happening in terms of the way it's perceived at the moment in the negotiations.
Thank you very much, Ms. Al Amer. Thank you for sharing the current detailed discussions around the Paris Agreement. Okay, I have one more there. Question to Ms. Noora. Under the Article 6 of Paris Agreement, is each of pure CCS, DAX, and VEX treated as emission reduction or removal?
So I think just critical to mention that nothing is being traded in terms of CCS at the moment at all, but the removals are DAX and BEX, whereas CCS emission reductions would be considered reductions. So there's a distinct separation between the two. So the guidance for removals that's being developed by the Article 6 supervisory body is just concerning direct air capture and storage and bioenergy capture and storage. So what is key here is how the storage component will be dealt with in the removals document, because that whatever decisions are being made in terms of monitoring and addressing leakages will most likely impact how CCS is handled later on, and how the for example, transferring the modalities and procedures and developing methodologies for CCS projects for emission reductions will be dealt with in general, could be impacted by whatever decisions are made in the removals component of the Article 6 supervisory body's work.
Thank you very much. And this, are we able to accept one more question? Okay. So do we have another one? According to the GCCSI Global Status of CCS 2022, South Africa mentioned CCS in their INDC and first NDC, but does not mention CCS in their first NDC update. This also applies to Egypt. In this regard, is there any reason why some countries considered CCS in their NDCs in the past, and currently they do not mention it anymore?
Yes. So in terms of South Africa's NDC, yes, we found that the latest NDC did not mention CCS, but what we're not sure why this is. So this will have to require some, bilateral, discussions with them to understand more why this happened. But in terms of Egypt's NDC, I've just pulled it up now because I think it does at least mention CCS, because, and even if it doesn't, we understand that we do work with the Egyptian government, and it seems that CCS will be part of the future in Egypt. So I think for Egypt, I can't really speak on their behalf, but I would say for that one, it's more, maybe there's more of a opportunity there. But again, yes, we're not really sure why this has happened for South Africa.
Thank you very much for your insightful and valuable answers. And thank you very much for your presentation again.